Today we're talking about Chapter 9, Cognition of Perception. This is a really interesting chapter in that he compares, your author, Heine, compares the East Asian mindset with the Western mindset. And the reason he does this, and the reason it's so extreme, one of the reasons is because he's from Canada, and the Canadian educational system is very similar to the English educational system, and the English educational system is very traditional, Western traditional. In the United States, we're a little bit more flexible than that, than they have in the educational system that they have in England. Somebody from Canada, when they finish high school, that's kind of like 13 years worth of education. So they're a little bit ahead of where we are in the United States as far as their educational understanding. Now you have to remember that Heine's wife is Japanese. So he has interacted with this, the different mindset, the different way of looking at the world on a fairly continuous basis from the day that he married his wife, because she's East Asian, she's Japanese. So it's really kind of fascinating, this book, and how he talks about the difference between holistic thinking and analytic thinking, because who would know better than someone that is married to somebody with a different context, a different way of looking at the world. So it's really kind of fascinating if you think about it in that context. So let's go ahead and get started. Cognition and perception. When stimuli are grouped according to the perceived similarity of their attributes, it is called a taxonomic categorization strategy. Taxonomic categorization answers are especially common among Westerners. And of course, if we look at this picture, we can put the three things together in different ways. We can say the dog and the rabbit are mammals. We can categorize them together, or we can put the carrot and the rabbit together, because the rabbit eats carrots. Thematic categorization strategy is where the stimuli are grouped together on the basis of causal, temporal, or spatial relationships. They're close to each other, therefore all three of these things could be categorized together because they're together. Time, temporal, that's what temporal means, time, or causal, the eating of the carrot by the rabbit. And the reason I showed this picture is because the dog has the hold of the carrot, not the rabbit. So that's one of the ways. It's kind of a joke. Thematic categorization is especially common in East Asia. This difference in categorization strategies reflects an underlying difference in the ways that people attend to their world. And one of the things we're going to discover in just a moment is that context is really important as far as East Asians are concerned, and not nearly as important in Western thinking. Analytic thinking is characterized by a focus on objects and their attributes. Objects are perceived as existing independently from their context. They are understood in terms of their component parts. Context is very important. One of the ways that we teach people in the United States is that if you were a psychologist, that's all you study. You just study psychology. You don't study everything. Whereas in Asia, in Japan, China, or Korea, if you were studying you wouldn't be studying psychology. They don't really study psychology like we do in the West. If you were studying something like engineering, you would study all of engineering. You would study everything that fit into that context. In the United States, we specialize, and that's because of our analytic thinking. So our educational structure is a little bit different. Sure, we have liberal arts in the United States, but it's only at the lower levels of college education. So analytic thinking is a little bit different, which creates a which creates an educational system that looks at the world a little bit differently in Asia and in the Western world. The attributes that make up objects are used as a basis for categorizing them, and a set of fixed abstract rules is used to predict and explain the behavior of these objects. Analytic thinking is more common in Western countries than in China, Japan, and Korea. So we're looking for rules, we're looking for ideas that fit a specific situation. That's the way we think in the Western world because we're analytic. In the Eastern world, in China, Japan, and Korea, they're more holistic. Holistic thinking is characterized by an orientation to the context as a whole. It represents an associative way of thinking, which gives attention to the relations among objects in the surrounding context. Context is always important in holistic thinking. Why? In holistic thinking, objects are understood in terms of how they relate to the rest of the context, and their behavior is predicted and explained on the basis of those relationships. So you're always looking for, in holistic thinking, you're always looking for relationships. Holistic thinking also emphasizes knowledge gained through experience rather than the application of fixed abstract rules. Holistic thinking is more common in East Asia. So in East Asia, that's one of the reasons why they admire their elders in East Asia because they have all that experience. So they have experienced all of these things. Now the problem with experiential knowledge is that with experiential knowledge, if you have never experienced something, can you know it? The question is, can you know it? And the answer is, well, in the West you can, because we teach beyond experience. But in East Asia, experience, if you haven't, you you have to experience something to have that knowledge. So it gets a little strange. Analytic thinkers tend to show field independence. They can separate objects from their background fields. Holistic thinkers tend to show field dependence. They tend to view objects as bound to their backgrounds. So if we were looking at these two pictures, if you're looking at this picture right here, if you were a holistic thinker, you'd go, oh my goodness, she doesn't have a torso. But as an analytic thinker, you can see that she is holding up a mirror. And because of the mirror, she's able to hide her torso behind the mirror, and it looks like she doesn't have a torso. But we know that she does have a torso. If we were a holistic thinker, we would see some dark dots and some light dots. But as analytic thinkers, we can look at this picture and we can see Michael Jackson's face. East Asians have been socialized from such a young age to attend to relationships that they do so unconsciously scanning scenes. Westerners have been socialized to attend to focal objects, and they thus habitually tend to direct their attention at such objects. So the difference between East Asian and Western thinking is that in East Asia it's so crowded that people have to be aware of their relationships between people, because that's how you can survive. You survive because you are one of a group, and that group is what allows you to survive. But in the Western world, we're all individuals, and because we are individuals, we see things differently. We don't look at everything as context. We look at if we see a person that's starving to death on the street, we see that person as starving to death on the street, and potentially will go and buy them a McDonald's cheeseburger. But if we were in Asia, that would just be part of the context. Yes, this is a poor neighborhood, and some people don't have enough food. I can't buy food for everybody, so I can't buy food for the starving person. A different way of viewing the world. Looking at the art of East Asia, we can see that the art is very different from Western art. East Asian art is painted with a higher horizon, creating more context in the picture. In their portraits, the background is much more complex, and the figures in the paintings are smaller than in Western art. And these are pictures from China, I believe. No, this is a picture from Korea. And as you can see, the background is very complex. High horizon, lots of information here. The people are tiny. This is from Korea, I'm sorry. Both these pictures are from Korea. And here are pictures from China, as you can see, very involved background. They're taking a picture of the young lady, but at the same time, there's an awful lot of context here. We know exactly what's going on in the background. And this is a picture of a landscape. As you can see, high horizon, so we get to see a lot of what's going on. This is from Japan, same thing here. She's moving on a water buffalo, it looks like. Anyway, we see all of this stuff. Not so much in this picture. We see who they are, but we don't really. But there's a lot of background filling things up. The people aren't as important as who they are and where they are. And of course, they're all musicians playing traditional Japanese instruments. This is a picture from the Louvre. And this is Mona Lisa, of course. I don't know what this picture is, but there's a cow, and I just noticed this cow. These are cherubs or angels, and all the people. Why they're in the ocean, I'm not exactly sure. Oh, he's got a hold of something. I don't know what he's got a hold of. Anyway, the people are more important than the background is. Masuda Gonzalez and colleagues in 2008 had American and East Asian students draw landscapes with a person, river, tree, house, and a horizon. They were seeking to see the difference between the two groups. And these are pictures that were drawn by the Americans. I'll show you a picture drawn by the East Asian. There you go. There's the guy right here. That's Rich drew this. As you can see, lots of context back there. East Asians drew a horizon that was significantly higher in the picture than it was for the Americans. East Asians tended to provide a more complex background in their drawings. East Asians included 75% more contextual objects than did the Americans. East Asians were more likely than Americans to situate their objects in context. And of course, there's the river, there's the trees, there's the background, and the person just barely has a face. But if we look at this one is really taken. The house, the car, the bicycle, the tree, the people. And the same thing with this. We see a little bit of clouds here, but it's the people that are important. Same thing here. This is a picture taken by an American, not by somebody that's Japanese. These are not Japanese people. They're dressed like Japanese people, but they're not. When East Asians take photographs of others, they tend to include more background. They also tend to have smaller figures in their portraits compared to Americans. This is a picture from Japan. As you can see, they're taking a picture of her. She's brushing her teeth and looking at her phone, but we get to see lots of the background. Here we get to see lots of background as well. We're looking at the puppy and the little girl, or little boy, little person. And even though this is the center of the picture, lots in the background as well. This is how Americans take pictures. There we go. And there we go. Context is not important. Background's not really important. We know these people are going on vacation. Can't see that little girl carrying that or even pulling that. That's a huge suitcase. When Masada Gonzalez and colleagues in 2008 looked at American and East Asian Facebook pages, they found that East Asian photos had smaller figures and larger backgrounds compared to American photos. And here we go, East Asian photos. East Asian photos. As weird as that is. Looking at Japanese photographs of buildings, researchers discovered that these photographs had more boundary structures than American photographs. Boundaries, so we're looking for straight lines. And this is full of straight lines. This is in Japan, and this is in Japan. Physical landscapes from Japan are literally busier than landscapes in the United States. And you can see how busy this picture is. And that picture is fairly busy. And those two pictures are really busy. Everything's square, everything's in a straight line. And there's the Capitol building, and there's a church. Not a whole lot going on. And there's a building, and this is a one-room schoolhouse. And there's a Chrysler building in New York, built in the 1920s. It's almost 100 years old. Since cities in East Asia tend to be more crowded than Western cities, living in the busier physical environment fosters the ability to attend to a lot more information at once. When they looked at how scientists from East Asia present their findings on posters, they had busier posters with more words than North American participants. This is a Western, as you can see, it's in English. This is a Western poster. And let me show you a East Asian poster. There you go. That's an East Asian poster. American poster, East Asian poster. Researchers looked at government and university websites in East Asia and North America. The Asian websites were much longer than the North American websites and had significantly more links and words. The East Asians websites were busier with more information for people to navigate. And of course, this is one from Japan. Researchers discovered that Westerners were more likely to explain people's behaviors in terms of their underlying dispositions, while East Asians and possibly people from other cultures were more likely to explain people's behaviors in terms of contextual variables. Now, this is really important because when we get these mass shootings that take place, one of the excuses that we make is that the person was evil. The person's evil. We're talking about their dispositions. And of course, that kind of excuses things. Well, he's just evil, and that's why he did what he did. And then we don't have to do anything else because there's nothing you can do about evil, right? So it's really kind of interesting. It's really kind of irritating when you listen to politicians and the news trying to explain why these shootings are taking place, and they excuse the whole situation as, well, they're just evil. They were insane. There was something wrong with them. They were mentally ill. So one of the ways that we're going to take care of these mass shootings is by increasing mental health, which they are right. We need to increase, we need to do a better job of looking at people and seeing their problems. Of course, everybody's got problems now, with COVID. Nobody expected COVID to last for such a long time. Now we've got a new subvariant that has come out. So potentially we may be in masks again. And of course, people don't like that. People need the interaction. I was talking to my daughter the other day, and she was complaining that I'm okay. I'm a homebody. I can stay home. But she and her son are both very sociable people. So they're suffering more from the whole COVID thing. My grandson needs to go to school. And of course, she teaches just like I do, but she can't stand to teach online. And I do fine online. I have no problem with being online. When people from India and the United States were asked to describe a person, the Americans were more likely to describe people in abstract personality traits, and Indians described people in concrete behaviors they observed. As an American, you'd say, well, she's friendly, she's attractive, she likes people. But in India, they would say, well, she brings cakes to my family on festival days. She helps my brother with his algebra, things like that. Researchers analyzing news stories of murders in the United States, China, and Japan discovered that East Asian papers describe murders in situational terms. The murder had a rivalry with another student. They had recently been fired. This is a reason for them doing what they are doing. The American reports tried to interpret the situation from a dispositional point of view. The murderer had a very bad temper. The shooter was described as mentally unstable. The shooter was evil. One of the huge questions that we have, why in the world would that guy take all those guns and all that ammunition up to a 14th floor and start shooting people at a concert in Las Vegas? Why in the world would somebody just pepper away at people like that with a bump stock, if you remember? It's like he was shooting a machine gun. And he had numerous weapons. How in the world did he get him up there, for one thing? But what was his mindset? Why was he doing this? What was wrong with the people at that concert? Personality information is not seen as equally important for explaining the behavior of others in all cultural contexts. Westerners tend to use personality information more for understanding others and themselves than East Asians do. And one of the reasons that we understand this is because we are individualists in the Western world. England, France, the United States, Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands, the Scandinavian countries, and the United States and Canada. We're talking about individuals who aren't that close to each other. But in Asia, you have to be. You have to be part of the community. Because if you're not part of the community, then you don't fit. You have to become part of the community in Asia. So personality is not that important in East Asia. But in the United States and in the Western world, it is, because we are individualists. We are people unto ourselves. We're not as tribal as they are in East Asia. In East Asia, if you come across, you go to a village, everybody acts pretty much the same. There are nuances between one person and another. But in the United States, if you visit in a neighborhood and you visit the different people, nobody would act the same. But in Asia, they would. And they would be expected to act the same. So that's the difference between Western personalities and Eastern personalities. Eastern personalities all primarily the same. And even if they're not the same, they are assumed to be very close to each other. There's just no reason to look at this aspect of the individual. People from many other non-Western cultures show a pattern of focusing on situation rather than the disposition, similar to East Asians. Social psychology: why do people do what they do? Suddenly have an urge to juggle machetes. Absolutely no machete juggling. And of course, he wants to do it anyway. Religious groups differ in their attributions as well. American Protestants are more likely than American Catholics to make dispositional attributions. This difference between sects appears to be a function of Protestants having a greater commitment to the idea that people have individual souls. Now, if you're not a Christian, who cares? It doesn't mean anything. But the reality is you're going to come in contact with people who are Catholic and people who are Protestant. And they do have different mindsets. I grew up in a Protestant town. And there were three different churches, three different Methodist churches in town. There were German German Methodists, there were English Methodists, and there were American Methodists. Now you think, what in the world's going on here? It really all depended on how fundamental you were. The Wesleyans, the English Methodists were more fundamental. The EUB had their own practices that weren't exactly the same as the Wesleyans. And then the first Methodist church was the American Methodist Church, and they were kind of a mixture of the three of them, of the two of them. So they were just a little bit more liberal. Really kind of fascinating. They had D-Malay. D-Malay was what it was. D-Malay was an organization that brought all three of the Methodist churches together. So they were a youth fellowship situation, and they had that's where all the dances were. And I couldn't go because I wasn't a member of any of the churches, so I really couldn't go. But I did go in there a couple times when I was dating somebody who was one of the degrees of Methodism. Really kind of bizarre. Okay, so what's the difference between Catholicism and Protestantism? The Protestants have a lot of different denominations: Lutherans, Episcopalians, Seventh-day Adventists, Methodist, Baptists. There's just a ton of them. And Episcopalians, Presbyterians. My wife's a Presbyterian. So, and they have different ways of looking at things. The Catholic Church is one church. The American Catholics are controlled by the local diocese. The local diocese is controlled by the national diocese. The national diocese is controlled by the Pope in the Vatican, in Vatican City. So the American Catholics are controlled. They're more centrally controlled. American Protestants, you never know. Some of these denominations don't even have central control. So it's pretty much you get what you get. But the difference is that Catholics have a more centralized way of looking at religion, at looking at going to heaven, at saving your soul. It's a more centralized concept. So everybody is kind of brought in together. If you're a Catholic, when the world ends, then if you're a good Catholic, everybody will get to go to heaven. But Protestants aren't that way. You can have good people and bad people in the same church, and the good people will go to heaven and the bad people won't. So it's more individualistic. Protestants are more individualistic than Catholics are. I know that's a long explanation, but this really gets kind of interesting. Of course, I told you that I was raised in a Methodist town, but we lived in Omaha for a while. Omaha is about 80% Catholic. So it was really kind of interesting. I coached high school soccer and for a public school, and there were a lot of Catholic schools in Omaha. So we were a smaller school, so we played against all these small Catholic schools. The whole idea was that that because we weren't Catholic, we were different, and therefore it was okay for them to rough us up, to play a little bit rougher against our team. So it got really kind of interesting dealing with all these Catholic schools. They wouldn't beat each other up, but they'd beat us up, or at least they tried. But we figured that out fairly quickly. The problem was when the referees were from those schools, it really got kind of interesting. So I had to tell my kids to cover themselves up because they're going to get hit. And anyway, we did fairly well against them. My kids were all farm kids, so they could take a blow. And of course, they all grew up with playing football, so they were used to people smacking into them. Of course, you're not supposed to do it. It's kind of like basketball. You're not really supposed to hit people, but it happened. And if the referees were fairly liberal, they would allow a lot of contact. Anyway, I told my kids not to do it, but just to make sure that if they got hit, they knew that they were going to get hit, and then they needed to cover themselves up. We did fairly well in the last. I coached for 5 years. First 2 years we got beat up pretty good, but in the last 3 years we did okay. We did okay. As a matter of fact, we won the sectional in my last year of coaching. So, is there a difference? Yeah, there's a difference. Oops, sorry. Oh, going the wrong direction. If people believe that people are judging them on the basis of what their soul has done, it follows that they are more likely to view the soul as being the cause of the individual's behavior. People's socioeconomic status predicts the kinds of attributions that people make. Working class Americans make more situational attributions and fewer dispositional attributions than middle class Americans. This gets really kind of interesting because I grew up in a blue collar town, so most of the kids that I was around, their parents were working class people. They worked in factories. And when you work in a factory, you rarely work alone. You usually work with somebody else. So you have to rely on that somebody to as to when you can get your job done. So if the person's working slower than you are, then you have to work slow in order to keep up with them. At the same time, especially if you're doing part work, the person that's in charge of you are the people that bring the parts over. They're the ones that allow the parts to come to you. So you're kind of controlled not only by the people around you, but by your bosses. So this gives you a different mindset than if you work as individually. You work by yourself. My dad was a banker. My mom was a nurse. So when we went to school, we were middle class. We were more middle class than the kids that were. I'm not saying my parents made more money. That's not true. Even a little bit. The factory workers made some pretty good bucks. The difference was the way they looked at the world. They saw the world as interacting. They were more collectivistic. They're and situational than the middle class people. So it was really kind of interesting. I married a young lady whose father was a factory worker, and it was really tough because my way of looking at the world was that I needed to succeed. Her way of looking at the world was, well, you need to get a factory job so that you can succeed. That is succeeding, being part of the group. And my idea was I need to be an individual. And eventually this kind of broke us up, mainly because we couldn't see eye to eye on whether I should go to college, whether I should get another degree. All of these things came into our discussions as to what we should do next. Didn't work out. My brother married a factory worker's daughter as well, and they've been married for almost 60 years. So they were able to stay together, but it was really kind of interesting because she wouldn't let him move. He needed to move in order to find another job, but she didn't want him to move. She wanted him to work there. She didn't want him to go anywhere. She wanted him to stay there. And so he couldn't find a job. The factories were closing down. So he had to find whatever he could find in the area. But they've stayed together for 60 years. But I'm sure they had to come to some compromise that I couldn't compromise with my wife. She didn't like the military at all. That didn't fit anything that she understood. Okay, so we're talking about the difference between working class and middle class people. Working class have more situational attributions. Middle class people have more dispositional attributions. And they found the same thing in France. They found the same thing in Russia. They found the same thing in India. Working class people are more situational, and middle class people are more dispositional. If analytic thinkers tend to view the world as operating to a set of universal abstract rules and laws, they will apply these rules and laws when trying to make sense of a situation. This is termed as rule-based reasoning. So analytic thinkers, more middle-class way of looking at the world, they're looking for rules. They want to see things happening in the same way every time. They're looking for rule-based reasoning. Holistic thinkers should be more likely to make sense of a situation by considering the relationships among objects and events. They should look for evidence of events clustering together, such as similarity among events or of temporal contiguity of events. This is termed associative reasoning. Now this really gets kind of interesting because rule-based reasoning is one way of looking at things, and associative reasoning is looking for context. So if we had two detectives, and this is one of the reasons why sometimes they pair detectives together in a certain way. You'll have one that is looking for rule-based reasoning. In other words, they're looking for a motive. They're looking for a way that you could potentially have done this, that you don't have an alibi. But the associative reasoner would look for context. Why would this person do this? So a lot of times they'll put an associative reasoner with a rule-based reasoner. And it makes for a good detective team because they look at things differently. And if you watch television shows, and we've been watching Britcoms, that's what we see. We see the rule-based reasoner being paired with the associative reasoner. Westerners appear to view change as occurring in linear ways. Change appears in static and predictable ways. Stock rises will rise after an election. Stocks will rise in 2020. They did. Stocks also, the question is, will they rise again in 2022? And will they rise again in 2024? East Asians believe that change happens in fluid and unpredictable ways, so they don't try to predict anything at all. And this is really kind of the difference in mindsets. So this is a story of Chinese unpredictability. This is a story that comes out of China. One day an old farmer's horse ran away from him. His neighbors came by to comfort him, but he said, "How can you know it isn't a good thing that my horse ran away?" A few days later, his horse came back, bringing a wild horse with it. His neighbors came to congratulate the old man, who said, "How can you know it isn't a bad thing?" A few weeks later, the old farmer's son was trying to ride the wild horse and fell off, breaking his leg. When the neighbors came over to express condolences, the old man said, "How can you know this isn't a good thing?" The next month, a war broke out, and all the able-bodied young men were recruited to fight it. The old man's son did not have to go because of his broken leg and survived with his father. East Asians have been shown to place more value on things that have happened in the past compared with the future. The opposite is found of North Americans. We're always looking to the future. Attitudes toward future vary across cultures, and East Asians have quite different expectations and predictions about the future compared with Westerners. Creativity is a generation of ideas that are novel, useful, and appropriate. Westerners prefer novel objects more than East Asians. They generate a larger number of ideas when they are primed with individualistic thoughts than collectivistic ones. And Asian Americans show more divergent thinking when primed with American culture compared with Asian culture. The novelty part of the equation appears to be facilitated by individualism and Western cultural experiences. Okay, so if we look at China, we look at Japan, and we look at Korea, we're looking at people that are very traditional. They're always looking to the past. But if we look at people in the United States, tradition isn't all that important in the United States. We're looking for people that are looking for novel, new ways of doing things. Good creative ideas involve novel solutions that are appropriate for the problem at hand. Collectivism appears to be associated with the generation of useful rather than novel ideas. In collective contexts, people are socialized to be concerned about the opinions of others and to find solutions that will fit with goals of the members of the group. This is very different because a Westerner will look for new ideas, and he won't care what all the other people in his group think at all. He's just looking for a new, innovative way of doing things. In a collectivistic society, in a collectivistic mindset, this same group that's looking for a solution to this problem will all have to agree. They're looking for appropriateness. They don't want anybody left out. In the West, of course, they're just looking for an answer to the problem. But in the East, they want everybody to get along. When Singaporeans were assigned to work together, researchers discovered that they were more likely to comment on appropriateness of their ideas than when they worked by themselves. Their ideas became less original in groups. Why? Because they weren't really they were trying to get along rather than find solutions to the problem. When the same research was done in Israel, they found that the Israelis were not affected by the presence of others in the same way. Each came up with novel ideas. When the same research was done in the Netherlands, they found that the Dutch were not affected by the presence of others in the same way. Just like the Israelis, they were looking for a solution to the problem, and it was easy for them to come together and come up with new ideas. However, when they did the same thing in Korea, they found that the Koreans reacted more similarly to the Singaporeans than the Israelis and the Dutch. So the Eastern way of thinking is you have to get along with everybody. It has to be appropriate for everybody in the group. But in the Western world, we're just looking for solutions to problems. We don't care if it's appropriate for that strange guy at the end. That's fine. We're just looking for answers to questions. More collectivistic East Asian cultures, with their emphasis on useful ideas, are more likely to foster incremental innovations, whereas more individualistic Western cultures, with their emphasis on novel ideas, encourage more breakthrough ideas. We have fewer ideas, but we have more breakthrough ideas. They're more novel. They just like this flying car. This is actually something that was invented in the United States in the the early 1950s. There was a television star named Robert Cummings, and he actually flew one of these things. The wings came off, the tail came off, and so he'd drive around Hollywood with just the airplane engine on top of his car, as weird as that may seem. But this is one of those innovative breakthrough ideas. Now, Japan is the world leader in the terms of number of patents it receives each year. Most of their patents represent incremental improvements, particularly in telecommunications, information technology, and electronics. And of course, this isn't something that you'd see in the United States. We don't sleep on the subway like this. It's too dangerous, for one thing. I don't think this is very practical, because if I fall asleep, my knees would collapse, and that's not very a good way to sleep. Now I could sleep this way, I think. Anyway, so the Japanese, they sleep on the subway. Not in the United States. We don't sleep in the on the subway in the United States. Talking and language have held a privileged position in much of Western intellectual history. Among the ancient Greeks, Homer concluded that there was no greater skill than to be a good debater, and Socrates thought that knowledge existed within people and could be revealed only through verbal reasoning. So talking was very important. In Judeo-Christian beliefs, the word was viewed as sacred because of the divine power to create. In the United States, of course, the First Amendment to the Constitution is the freedom of speech. So speaking in the United States and the freedom to speak is a birthright. Speaking is valued in the West because it is viewed as an act of self-expression and as an inextricably bound to thought. So the more you think, the more you speak. The more you speak, the more you think. In many East Asian cultural traditions, there has been less emphasis on talking, if not outright suspicion of the spoken word. This is a Laotian proverb. Laos, of course, is one of the Southeast Asian countries. It's right next to Vietnam. Listen with one ear, be suspicious with the other, because you can't trust the spoken word. That's a Laotian proverb. Lao Tzu wrote, "He who knows does not speak. He who speaks does not know." So the idea is the less you speak, the more you know. And the more you know, the less you'll speak, which seems kind of counterintuitive. How in the world are you going to let other people know if you won't speak? But that's a Western way of thinking, a linear Western way of looking at things. Practitioners of many Eastern religions pursue truth through silent meditation rather than through spoken prayer. A Korean proverb states, "An empty cart makes more noise." Eastern cultural traditions have not cultivated a belief that thought and speech are closely related. Japanese mothers have been shown to speak less to their children than American mothers. Chinese infants as young as 7 months have been shown to vocalize less in response to laboratory events than European American infants. Much of what is communicated in the course of a conversation goes beyond the actual words that are used and is expressed in nonverbal gestures, facial expressions, and voice tone. People seem to be easier to upset in an email than when you are face to face with them. They can't see your smile and your wink. They can't see that you're just kidding. And that's one of the reasons why we use emoticons. People often resort to adding emoticons or abbreviations to their email or text messages to add the nonverbal contextual cues that are lacking in emails or text messages. Nonverbal communication is important in all cultures, but there are some rather pronounced cultural differences in the degree to which communication relies on explicit verbal information versus more implicit nonverbal cues. In high context cultures, people are deeply involved with each other, and this involvement leads them to have much shared information that guides their behavior. Much of what is to be communicated can be inferred because people have a great deal of information in common that they can that they can rely on, and thus they can be less explicit in what they say. East Asians are is a good example of high context culture. Western and English-speaking countries are generally good examples of low context cultures, which is conveyed in verbal communication in East Asian languages is less explicit than what is communicated in English. And this may be one of the reasons why chatting up an East Asian for somebody from the West, not the best idea in the world. The words that are said in Japan are often less important than the way that they are said. A pause and a strained look on the face of a Japanese speaker communicates that the information they have is dissatisfying no matter what words they use. The key information is conveyed nonverbally, with the content of the words sometimes being rather empty. And of course, this is what happened before World War II. The Japanese were indicating to us that they were upset because they got most of their oil from the Western world, and we had a tariff on their oil. We weren't sending them any more oil. As far as they were concerned, it was fairly obvious that we were going to attack, no matter what they said, that they were going to attack. No matter what they said, it was obvious that that's what was going to happen as far as they were concerned, because that's the way it works in their country. In the United States, of course, if we say it, we have to say it before you can believe it. So we were listening to what they were saying, but not how they were saying it. And then, of course, there was the attack on Pearl Harbor. As far as they were concerned, it should have been obvious that they were going to do something. But we missed it. Since so much is conveyed through nonverbal communication by the Japanese, they tend to have far more trouble leaving messages on answering machines. They're more selective of their wording because they are visualizing how the person on the other end is receiving their message. And that is the end of the chapter. So I'll talk to you guys next week.